Vitiate gathered his followers on a single planet and performed one ritual. When it was finished, the planet was dead, not just the people on it, but the planet itself in the Force. Force sensitives who walked its surface thousands of years earlier felt nothing at all. But it didn't start there. Not every Sith is the same kind of threat. Some rule galaxies, while others manipulated events from the shadows across entire generations, and a few became so consumed by the dark side that they stopped being people entirely. And some of them, the ones at the very top, found a way to simply refuse to die. 7 levels, and each one answers a different question, not just how powerful a Sith is, but what kind of power they believe in, what they spend to get it, and what that belief slowly turns them into. The further up you go, the harder it becomes to recognize what came in at the bottom. Most students who walked into the Sith Academy on Korriban never walked out. The Academy was not a school, but a deliberate filter. In The Path of Destruction by Drew Karpyshyn, a Legends novel, it served one function. Students competed under live conditions with real consequences, and most would not survive to the next stage. The question with expendables is not who they are, but what the system is using them for. Foharg walked into Korriban looking like exactly the kind of student the Academy rewarded. He was aggressive, physically strong, and ready to use violence to dominate anyone weaker than him. On the surface, that made him look dangerous, but in reality, it made him exactly the profile the Academy had the most of. What he didn't realize was that the traits the Academy praised were the same traits that made him replaceable. Aggressive enough to survive a fight, cruel enough to fit the culture, strong enough to look like a candidate, but nothing rare enough that losing him would cost the system anything. The Academy did not need Foharg to become something greater. It needed him to burn out in front of someone who would. And this is the part of the Sith tradition that gets lost behind the spectacle of their greatest figures. The worldview treats people as fuel from day one. It is not a late-stage corruption that only appears at the Void tier or at the Eternal tier. It is the foundation every higher tier is built on. The Sith who eventually consumed planets or bodies for centuries were trained at 15 years old inside a system that was already doing the same thing to them in miniature. This tier is also where every Sith begins, whether they stay or not. Darth Bane, the architect of the Rule of Two generations later, entered Korriban the same way, as a late recruited former Cortosis miner named Acel, who the system was ready to use and discard. The difference between Foharg and Bane was not where they started, it was what they did with the time the Academy gave them before it was done with them. Some survived it. Almost none of the ones who survived figured out what to do next, and the ones who did not figure it out still became dangerous, just not in the way they thought. One person needed to be stopped from escaping a planet, and Darth Malak's solution was to destroy the planet. The entire world and every person on it were gone, not because there was no other option, but because destruction was faster. Taurus was a populated world, and the target was a single individual. Yet in the Legends game Knights of the Old Republic, Malak ordered the orbital strike without hesitation, accepting the complete loss of the planet as a reasonable price for preventing Bastila Shan's escape. The Warbringer is what an expendable looks like after they survive the Academy, but never outgrow its logic. They do not see power as leverage, patience, or positioning. They see it as the ability to end things, and they believe that ending things at greater scale means they're becoming stronger. For Malak, Bastila's escape was a tactical problem, and destroying the planet was him showing the galaxy what he could do in response. To him, the two were the same move, one just made louder than the other. The Warbringer does not want to win, they want to overwhelm. When a Sith stops seeing the difference between those two things, that confusion shapes every decision after. They read the silence around them as proof that the overwhelming is working, when what they're actually producing is distance. People comply because they're hoping the next demonstration lands on someone else, and they do it while quietly moving themselves further from the center. The Warbringer is power at its most insecure, still needing to keep proving what a more confident form of power would not have to prove at all. And the tradition keeps producing Warbringers, not by accident, but because the Sith Academy teaches dominance as the working definition of strength from the first day. Most students never untrain themselves out of that definition. When one of them becomes powerful enough to level a planet, what comes out is not a corrupted Sith, but the standard product of the curriculum at scale. The one thing a Sith at this tier cannot see coming is the threat that never announces itself as one. For months, no one at Korriban could point to what Githani was doing. Introduced in Path of Destruction, Githani operated inside an academy built to reward combat power, force strength, and physical dominance. She could fight, but she was not spending her energy there. She was building influence. Quietly, through conversations and alliances, the academy had no way to rank. By the time anyone understood what had happened, the outcome was already decided. The warbringer cannot sit still. And the Phantom builds on that, specifically on the gap between what looks like nothing happening and what is actually being set up. But everything changed when a Phantom had to operate under the eye of someone trained to see exactly this kind of move. Darth Zana, whose story is the spine of Rule of Two, ran this at the highest possible level of difficulty. She was Darth Bane's apprentice, which meant she operated in daily proximity to one of the most powerful Sith alive, a man who knew, by design, that she would eventually move against him. Under the Rule of Two, that move was guaranteed, and Bane was watching for it. Zana lived inside that watch for years, and she made no mistakes. What concealment does to the person using it is the part that the Sith tradition almost never addressed. Performing loyalty every day to someone you're actively planning to kill is sustained psychological pressure, and most people would break under it. And the Phantom who succeeds does not just deceive their master, they get so good at concealment that the part of them still capable of being known starts to disappear. Not through any choice they made, but because concealment stopped being a skill they used and became the shape of the person using it. But the Phantom did not end with Zana. In Dynasty of Evil, the final volume of the trilogy, Darth Cognis added a quality the earlier Phantoms did not need: judgment under limited time. The lower version of Patience reacts to openings, but Cognis reacted only to the right opening, and that meant watching the wrong ones pass. Above this level, the goal is no longer to work within existing structures. What comes next is not maneuver inside a system, it tears the system down and builds a new one from the wreckage. Nagasato did not wait for a war, he built one from the ground up. From inside the Sith Empire's political structure, Sato, from the Tales of the Jedi comics, engineered the conditions that dragged the Republic and the Empire into open war. Not because war was going to happen on its own, but because he needed it to. He was not a soldier rising through a conflict, but the author of one, writing the script that the Sith Empire, the Republic, and his own rivals would all act out without knowing they had been cast. The Conqueror is the first tier where the Sith stops playing inside the game and starts writing it. At this tier, winning fights stops being the goal and redrawing the political order takes its place. The Conqueror can delegate a military campaign, an administrative region, a diplomatic mission, but what they cannot delegate is their own personal presence inside every decision that matters. And that presence is the only thing actually holding the Empire together. The moment a subordinate is allowed to make one of those decisions on their own, that subordinate becomes a competing source of authority. Sato hit that wall, and every Conqueror hits that wall. The difference between this tier and the Warbringer is not how they take territory, but the fact that they're trying to govern what they take. Taking territory proves force, but holding it requires structure, and while force is something a Conqueror always has in abundance, structure is something no single person can actually be, no matter how much of themselves they pour into the attempt. That is why Sato lost, and the war went with him. And one Sith had spent his entire life watching that happen, and he understood exactly why. The Sith Order Darth Bane inherited was not empty, and his answer was to burn it down. In the Darth Bane trilogy by Drew Karpyshyn, another Legends work, Bane arrived at a specific diagnosis. The Order had hundreds of practitioners competing with each other constantly for resources, influence, and standing, which meant it spent as much energy on itself as on the Jedi. The problem was not the people, but the structure. The architect is the Sith who stops asking how to win and starts asking what kind of structure would make victory inevitable later. Bane was not the first to watch the Old Order fail, but he was the first to draw the actual conclusion from watching. His answer would shape the next 1,000 years of galactic history. One master, one apprentice, and no more than that. Every generation, the Order's full power narrowed to 2 people, passed forward through betrayal, built towards one final Sith capable of what the army never was. Every architecture sacrifices something to survive, and Bane sacrificed more than the Sith usually admit. His design bought continuity, concentration, and discipline, and it paid for them with redundancy, institutional memory, and margin for error. The whole plan depends on every master choosing the right apprentice, every betrayal landing in favor of the stronger party, and no outside force wiping out the pair before the next one is ready. One bad pick, one unlucky encounter, one apprentice who moves too early or too late, and 1,000 years of work dies with them, with no second pair and no backup anywhere to carry it on. The plan worked, but that does not mean it was safe. It means the Sith got lucky for a long time inside a system with no margin for being anything else. However, not every architect built through institutions. Something unprecedented was happening in parallel, and it did not need a throne to work. Darth Traya, central to Knights of the Old Republic 2, worked through people. She taught both Sith and Jedi, steering how those around her understood the nature of the Force itself. Her influence moved through individuals she had shaped, who went on to produce consequences she had already designed for long before they understood what was happening. The architect does not rule through armies, but through people you thought were your own, shaped long before you met them. All 5 of those tiers want something. The next shows what happens when that wanting is gone entirely. There was no plan, and by the time Darth Nihilus began moving, there was nothing left in him capable of forming one. In Knights of the Old Republic 2 and The Essential Guide to the Force, both legend sources, Nihilus consumed Force-sensitive life on a planetary scale, not in pursuit of any objective, but because consumption was the only mode his existence had left. Darth Sion arrived at the same place through a completely different path, depicted in the game as a figure held together past the point where his end should have come, not by biology, but by the dark side and the rage it ran through, with a body that was broken long ago, and stayed that way. He did not choose to persist, he simply could not stop. The void is where Sith mastery pushes past the point where mastery remains possible. The Sith tradition defines itself through the practitioner being the one wielding the dark side, and the void is what the practitioner becomes when that relationship inverts. Nihilus is the hunger, and Sion is the pain. And in both cases, the practitioner is no longer using the dark side at all, because the dark side is using what is left of them. Yet the power this produces is far more limited than it appears. Nihilus could drain entire populations, but he could also be countered by someone who understood what he was. Sion could not be stopped through ordinary means, but he was not invulnerable to the right kind of resistance. Neither could be given objectives or relied upon to produce a predictable outcome. They were the most powerful things in any room they entered, and the room could do nothing with them. The Sith Order did not change its doctrine after seeing this, and the real question is, why? One explanation is arrogance, a belief that Nihilus and Sion were outliers, rather than proof the whole system could break. Another is that the Order saw them as useful, even so, weapons that cannot be controlled, but could still be pointed at an enemy at least once. The structural answer is harder to avoid. After Bane, the Rule of Two left the Sith with no council, no archive, and no collective body to review what had gone wrong. Just 2 people, at any given time, with their own goals, and their own reasons not to ask questions that might slow them down. Institutional memory requires an institution, and the Sith, by their own design, no longer had one. So the lesson was never drawn, and the same pattern came back in the final generation of the Order. Mastery collapsing into the thing the practitioner was trying to control inside Vader, inside the relationship between Vader and Sidious, inside the belief that the dark side could be held by 2 people and directed cleanly across a galaxy. The Sith stopped being able to learn from themselves long before they stopped winning. That silence is not accidental, it is the most revealing thing the Order ever did. But the void was not the only answer to the problem of mastery pushed past its limits. There was one more, and it crossed the same threshold without losing control on the way out. Mark Aragnos chose for a century, holding back every rival, every challenge, every moment someone else calculated whether the time was right, but then he died. The succession crisis that erupted the moment he was gone showed what his presence had actually been doing. The conflict between Nagasato and Ludo Kresh, depicted in the Tales of the Jedi comics, was not a power vacuum, but proof that every rival capable of moving against him had spent a century calculating whether the moment was right. When he was gone, that calculation vanished with him, and what followed escalated directly into the Great Hyperspace War. Further back still, Ajuntapal predates Ragnos by thousands of years, the first Dark Lord of the Sith in the Legends timeline. By the time of Knights of the Old Republic, thousands of years after his death, his spirit still occupied his tomb on Korriban, not as a historical record, but as a continued presence, still there for anyone willing to seek him out. And what came after him would not wait to be found, it went looking. Vitiate, also known as Valkorion in Star Wars The Old Republic, is the full expression of this tier, his influence spanning roughly 15 centuries of active manipulation across the galaxy. His first major ritual consumed the life of an entire planet. He built the Sith Empire that defined the Old Republic era, then watched every comparable figure around him fall until he was the last one standing. He moved across bodies, identities, centuries, not a leftover waiting to be found, but something still operating. The Eternal is the Sith who does not just outlive death, but who keeps choosing across spans of time that should dissolve identity. And the question at this tier is not how that is possible, but what it erases. Every century Vitiate lives through is a century of loss. The people he used to know die, the institutions he helped build get replaced, languages shift, and apprentices rise and are discarded before the next generation begins. What that does to a person is not dramatic, it is quiet. A person is partly held in place by the people who know them, and when those people are gone long enough, the parts of the self that relied on them go too. The version of him that existed before the ritual on his home world is separated from him now by too many centuries and too many bodies to still feel like his own, and functionally, it is someone else's life he is remembering. He still makes decisions, but he makes them as the thing that is left after everything that could anchor him was outlived. Survival is not the power, but what the power costs, paid in pieces of the person who started. One mistake across that time frame would have reset everything to zero, and he never made one. That is what puts him at this tier, but the harder question is what it got him in return. After 15 centuries of that, the unsettling thing is not the power, but that something is still choosing. The dark side did not pull these practitioners in the same direction, it amplified whatever was already there. If this breakdown changed how you see the Sith, the Stormtroopers and Darth Vader have their own full breakdowns on the channel. Both follow the same structure, and both go places you might not expect.